Picture this. You're standing in the opulent halls of Versailles in 1693, silk gown rustling against marble floors as you make your way through corridors lined with golden mirrors. The scent of burning candles mingles with something metallic, something wrong that makes your stomach turn. Through ornate doors, you catch glimpses of courtiers whispering behind jeweled fans, their voices carrying fragments of the most scandalous rumor ever to grace the French court. A queen, they say, has done the unthinkable. Not adultery, not treason, but something so horrific that even hardened nobles cross themselves when they speak of it. In her desperation to save her dying son, Marie Thérèse of Austria, Queen of France, committed an act that would haunt the monarchy for generations. She drank his blood. Before diving into this forgotten tale of maternal desperation and royal horror, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the secrets that shaped our past. This isn't the sanitized version of royal history you learned in school, where queens wore beautiful gowns and lived fairy tale lives. This is the story of a woman driven to madness by grief, of a mother who crossed every boundary of human decency in a futile attempt to cheat death itself. Tonight, you'll discover what really happened behind those gilded doors when desperation met superstition, when royal privilege collided with the most primitive of human instincts, and when a queen's love for her child transformed into something monstrous. The woman who would become known as the Blood Queen was born Maria Thérèse of Austria in 1638, daughter of Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France. From birth, she was a political pawn in the endless chess game of European monarchy. Her marriage to Louis XIV in 1660 wasn't about love or compatibility. It was about ending the Franco-Spanish War and cementing an alliance that would reshape the balance of power across Europe. At 22, she left everything she had ever known, trading the familiar warmth of Madrid's royal palace for the cold grandeur of French court life. The young queen spoke broken French with a thick Spanish accent that courtiers mocked behind her back. She dressed in the heavy, formal styles of Spain while French fashion demanded flowing silks and plunging necklines. Her deeply religious nature clashed with the libertine attitudes that flourished under her husband's rule. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was already establishing his reputation as one of history's most magnificent monarchs, but also one of its most faithless husbands. Within months of their wedding, he was openly flaunting mistresses while Marie Thérèse retreated into increasing isolation. But there was one role where the Spanish queen found purpose, one duty that gave meaning to her otherwise lonely existence. Motherhood. When she gave birth to Louis, the Grand Dauphin, in 1661, something awakened in Marie Thérèse that had been dormant during her loveless marriage. This child became her entire world, the single bright flame in the cold darkness of Versailles. She poured into him all the affection her husband denied her, all the passion that court protocol demanded she suppress. The Dauphin was everything a future king should be. Tall, handsome, intelligent, with the golden hair of his Bourbon father and the gentle temperament of his Habsburg mother. Marie Thérèse supervised every aspect of his education, from his Latin lessons to his writing instruction. She personally selected his tutors, monitored his health with obsessive attention, and spent hours each day in his company, speaking to him in Spanish when they were alone together. The court whispered that she loved the boy too much, that her devotion bordered on the unhealthy. Perhaps they were right. But in a world where royal children were often treated as political commodities rather than beloved sons and daughters, Marie Thérèse's fierce maternal protection seemed almost revolutionary. She refused to let him be sent away for his education, as was customary. She insisted on tasting his food before he ate, checking his bedchamber for drafts, ensuring his clothes were properly warmed before he dressed. The king found her behavior embarrassing, but he tolerated it because the Dauphin was healthy, thriving, and displayed all the qualities expected of a future monarch. For nearly 30 years, this arrangement worked. The Dauphin grew into manhood under his mother's watchful eye, married well, produced heirs of his own. Louis XIV continued his affairs and his wars, while Marie Thérèse found contentment in her role as the realm's most devoted mother. But in 1688, everything changed. The Dauphin, now 27 years old and at the height of his vigor, began experiencing strange symptoms that baffled the royal physicians. It started with fatigue. The prince who had once hunted from dawn to dusk now struggled to complete a morning's correspondence. His appetite vanished, his skin took on a grayish pallor, and he complained of constant pain in his joints and abdomen. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, the king's personal physician, diagnosed a variety of ailments from melancholy to digestive troubles, but his treatments only seemed to make the Dauphin weaker. Marie Thérèse watched her son's decline with growing desperation. She summoned physicians from across Europe, offering massive payments for anyone who could restore her boy's health. Spanish doctors, Italian specialists, even practitioners of folk medicine were brought to Versailles in secret. Each promised miraculous cures, each took her money, and each left the Dauphin unchanged or worse than before. The queen's behavior grew increasingly erratic as her son's condition deteriorated. She stopped attending court functions, refused to leave the wing of the palace where the Dauphin's apartments were located, and began displaying signs of the religious mania that had always lurked beneath her pious exterior. She commissioned hundreds of masses for her son's recovery, made pilgrimages to every saint's shrine within a day's journey of Versailles, and filled his rooms with holy relics that she believed possessed healing powers. But it wasn't enough. By 1692, the Dauphin was confined to his bed, his once powerful frame reduced to skin and bones. His breathing came in labored gasps, his eyes had sunk deep into his skull, and his hands shook so violently he could barely hold a cup of water. The royal physicians spoke in hushed tones about preparing the court for the inevitable, but Marie Thérèse refused to accept their verdict. She had lost everything else in her life, her homeland, her husband's love, her position at court. She would not lose her son. He would not. That's when she met Madame de Montespan's former servant, a woman named Catherine Deschaise, better known as La Voisin. This mysterious figure operated in the shadowy world between medicine and magic that flourished in the darker corners of Versailles. La Voisin claimed to possess knowledge passed down from ancient practitioners, secrets that conventional physicians dismissed, but desperate people paid fortunes to access. The meeting took place in the dead of night, in a chapel deep within the palace's oldest wing. Marie Thérèse, disguised in a servant's plain cloak, knelt before an altar lit only by black candles while La Voisin explained the ritual that could save her son's life. The theory was rooted in medieval beliefs about the transfer of vital essences between family members. A mother's blood, she claimed, carried the same life force that had originally created the child. If consumed fresh and warm, it could restore strength that illness had stolen away. The process would be simple, La Voisin assured her. A small cut on the queen's wrist, blood collected in a silver chalice, mixed with sacred wine and specific herbs whose names she spoke in Latin whispers. The Dauphin would drink it while unconscious, never knowing the source of his medicine. If performed during the new moon, when spiritual barriers were thinnest, the ritual could transfer the mother's vitality directly to her dying child. Marie Thérèse listened to this blasphemous proposal with the intensity of a woman drowning who has been thrown a rope. Everything rational in her mind screamed that this was madness, that no good could come from such dark practices. But everything maternal in her heart clung to this final hope. If there was even the smallest chance that her blood could save her son's life, how could she refuse? The first ceremony took place 3 nights later. Marie Thérèse waited until the palace settled into sleep, then made her way through secret passages to the Dauphin's bedchamber. La Voisin was already there, having bribed the guards and dismissed the prince's attendants with stories about a special treatment ordered by the king himself. The dying man lay unconscious, his breathing so shallow that each exhale might have been his last. With hands that trembled from fear and determination, Marie Thérèse allowed La Voisin to make the cut across her wrist. The pain was sharp but brief, nothing compared to the agony of watching her son waste away. Her blood flowed dark and thick into the silver chalice, mixing with wine and herbs until it resembled some hellish communion beverage. La Voisin chanted in Latin while Marie Thérèse held her son's head, tilting the mixture between his lips and watching it disappear down his throat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Dauphin's breathing seemed to deepen slightly. His color appeared less gray in the candlelight. Marie Thérèse convinced herself she could see improvement, that the ritual was working, kissed his forehead and whispered prayers that her sacrifice was saving her beloved child. She of gratitude as La Voisin cleaned the chalice and disappeared into the darkness from which she had come. The next morning brought what seemed like a miracle. The Dauphin was awake, alert, and asking for food for the first time in weeks. His physicians were baffled by the sudden improvement, but Marie Thérèse knew the truth. Her blood had given him strength, had pulled him back from death's threshold through the power of maternal love made literal. She felt vindicated, triumphant, certain that she had discovered the secret to saving her son's life. But the improvement lasted only days before the Dauphin's condition began deteriorating again. This time, Marie Thérèse didn't hesitate. She summoned La Voisin immediately, and they performed the ritual again. And again. Each ceremony seemed to provide temporary relief, a brief return of color to the prince's cheeks, a few hours of coherent conversation. But each improvement was shorter than the last, and the decline between treatments grew more severe. As weeks turned into months, Marie Thérèse found herself trapped in a cycle that grew more desperate with each passing night. The cuts on her wrists multiplied, thin silver scars that she hid beneath elaborate lace cuffs and jeweled bracelets. La Voisin's visits became more frequent, her demands for payment more extravagant, and her rituals more elaborate. What had begun as a simple blood offering evolved into something far more sinister. The sorceress claimed that the initial ritual had worked too well, that the Dauphin's illness was fighting back against the healing power of his mother's essence. Stronger measures were needed. The blood must be drawn during specific astrological alignments. Special incantations had to be spoken in tongues that predated Christianity. Most disturbing of all, the quantity required kept increasing. Where once a few drops had sufficed, La Voisin now demanded goblets full of the queen's life force. Marie Thérèse submitted to these escalating demands without question. Her world had narrowed to a single obsession, preserving her son's life at any cost. She stopped eating regular meals, claiming her stomach was troubled, but the truth was that she needed to conserve her strength for the bloodletting ceremonies. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed her growing pallor, the way she sometimes swayed during morning prayers, but they attributed her condition to worry over the Dauphin's illness. The court physicians began to whisper among themselves about the queen's deteriorating health. Dr. Fagan observed her during a consultation about the Dauphin and noted her sunken eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way she seemed to fade into her elaborate gowns like a ghost inhabiting royal clothes. When he suggested she might benefit from medical attention herself, Marie Thérèse dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. Her health was irrelevant as long as her son needed her strength. But the Dauphin wasn't improving. If anything, the mysterious treatment seemed to be making his condition more erratic. He would experience sudden surges of energy that left him manic and incoherent, followed by crashes that brought him closer to death than ever before. During his lucid moments, he complained of strange dreams where he tasted copper and heard voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize. The physicians noted these symptoms with growing alarm. Suspecting some form of poisoning but unable to identify the source, La Voisin had explanations for every setback. The Dauphin's spirit was particularly strong, she claimed, which made it more resistant to healing. His royal blood carried curses from generations of political enemies who had wished harm upon the Bourbon line. The treatments were working, but they needed to be intensified, made more potent through the addition of elements that she described in whispered conferences with the queen. These new ingredients horrified even Marie Thérèse's compromised conscience. Ground bones from saints' relics, herbs harvested from graveyards under specific moon phases, and most disturbing of all, blood from other sources. La Voisin claimed that mixing the queen's maternal essence with blood from sacrificed animals would amplify its healing properties. She produced vials of dark liquid that she claimed came from doves, lambs, and other creatures associated with purity and innocence. The queen found herself participating in ceremonies that grew more elaborate and blasphemous with each iteration. The chapel where they met was transformed into something unrecognizable, its Christian symbols covered with pagan marks that Lavoisin painted in mixtures of ash and blood. Candles arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly cast shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. The air grew thick with incense that smelled of things better left unnamed. During these rituals, Marie Thérèse entered states of consciousness that frightened her, even as they provided temporary relief from her crushing anxiety. She would find herself speaking in voices that weren't her own, reciting words in languages she had never learned. Her body would move without her conscious direction, performing gestures and dances that felt both ancient and forbidden. In these moments, she felt connected to something vast and terrible, a power that promised to save her son in exchange for sacrifices she was only beginning to understand. The physical toll on the queen became impossible to hide. Her elaborate wigs concealed hair that had begun falling out in patches. Her famous Habsburg complexion, once described as porcelain perfection, now resembled aged parchment stretched over a skull. She required assistance to walk more than a few steps, and her hands shook so violently that she could no longer write legible letters. The court attributed these changes to maternal grief, but a few observant servants began to suspect something more sinister. Chief among these was Madame de Maintenon, Louis XIV's secret wife, who had always viewed Marie Thérèse with a mixture of pity and contempt. Maintenon's network of informants throughout the palace brought her disturbing reports about the queen's midnight wanderings, the strange smells emanating from certain chapel areas, and the mysterious woman who seemed to appear and disappear without using any of the palace's known entrances or exits. Maintenon's suspicions deepened when she noticed changes in the Dauphin himself. During his increasingly rare appearances at court functions, he seemed different in ways that went beyond physical illness. His eyes held a haunted quality that reminded her of prisoners she had seen during her youth in the Caribbean, people who had been broken by experiences they couldn't describe. He would stare at his mother with an expression that mixed love and terror, as if he recognized her but feared what she had become. The breakthrough in understanding what was happening came from an unexpected source. Father Letellier, the king's confessor, had been troubled by reports from other palace clergy about desecrated chapels and missing holy objects. His investigation led him to discover hidden rooms beneath the oldest sections of Versailles, chambers that had been modified for purposes that violated every principle of Christian worship. What Father Letellier found in those underground spaces would haunt him for the rest of his life. Altars stained with substances he couldn't identify, chalices that had been perverted for unholy purposes, books written in scripts that seemed to writhe on the pages when viewed in candlelight. And most damning of all, evidence of regular ceremonies involving the consumption of human blood in quantities that suggested the donor was being systematically drained. The priest faced an impossible dilemma. Exposing the truth would destroy the monarchy at a time when France needed stability above all else. The king was aging, the succession was uncertain, and rumors of witchcraft in the royal family could trigger the kind of religious and political chaos that had torn England apart during the previous century. But allowing these practices to continue violated every oath he had taken as a servant of God. Father Letellier chose a middle path that satisfied neither his conscience nor his political obligations. He confronted Marie Thérèse directly, appearing in her apartments one morning with evidence of what he had discovered. The queen's reaction confirmed his worst fears. She didn't deny the accusations or express shock at his discoveries. Instead, she fell to her knees and begged him to understand that everything she had done was motivated by maternal love. The priest listened in horror as Marie Thérèse described the rituals in detail, her voice growing more animated as she recounted each ceremony. She spoke of feeling her son's life force strengthen with each offering of her blood, of sensing spiritual barriers dissolving as they shared essence in ways that transcended normal human connection. She claimed that during the most intense rituals, she could feel herself becoming one with the Dauphin, their souls merging until she couldn't tell where her consciousness ended and his began. Father Letellier recognized the signs of spiritual possession or madness, possibly both. The woman kneeling before him bore little resemblance to the pious Spanish princess who had arrived at Versailles 30 years earlier. Her eyes burned with fanatic intensity. Her voice carried undertones that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her throat, and her entire being radiated an energy that felt fundamentally wrong in ways his theological training had never prepared him to encounter. But even as he recoiled from what Marie Thérèse had become, the priest couldn't deny the complexity of her situation. The Dauphin's condition had indeed stabilized somewhat during the period when these rituals were taking place. Medical science offered no explanation for his survival this long, and conventional treatments had proven completely ineffective. Was it possible that maternal desperation had stumbled upon some form of healing that existed outside Christian understanding? The question tormented Father Letellier as he struggled to decide how to respond to his discovery. Church doctrine was clear about the consumption of human blood and traffic with supernatural forces. But the reality of watching a mother sacrifice her own life force to save her child created moral ambiguities that his training hadn't anticipated. Was this the ultimate expression of maternal love, or the ultimate perversion of it? His contemplation was interrupted by news that made immediate action necessary. La Voisin had been arrested in connection with the affair of the poisons, the scandal that was rocking Versailles as investigators uncovered a network of fortune-tellers, poisoners, and practitioners of dark arts who had been serving the highest levels of French society. Under torture, she was revealing names and details about ceremonies that implicated dozens of prominent courtiers. Father Letellier realized that it was only a matter of time before La Voisin's confessions reached Marie Thérèse. The queen's involvement in blood rituals would not only destroy her personally, but could bring down the entire monarchy. The priest made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would give Marie Thérèse one final chance to save herself and her son through conventional means, but if she refused, he would be forced to take more drastic action to protect the crown. The confrontation between priest and queen took place in the Chapel of Mirrors, that sacred space where Marie Thérèse had once prayed for guidance as a young bride. Now, 30 years later, she knelt before the same altar where she had begged God for her husband's love, this time pleading for her confessor's understanding. Father Letellier's ultimatum was simple but devastating. She must cease all contact with La Voisin immediately, submit to spiritual purification, and allow the Dauphin's fate to rest in God's hands alone. Marie Thérèse's response revealed the depth of her transformation. The meek Spanish princess who had once accepted every humiliation with Christian resignation was gone, replaced by something fierce and desperate. She rose from her knees with eyes blazing, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any scream. She told the priest that he understood nothing about a mother's love, nothing about the responsibilities that came with royal blood, nothing about the powers that existed beyond his narrow theological comprehension. What happened next would be debated in secret church archives for centuries. Father Letellier later claimed that Marie Thérèse's appearance changed as she spoke, that her shadow seemed to move independently of her body, that the temperature in the chapel dropped until their breath formed clouds in the air. He swore that he heard voices speaking through her mouth, ancient tongues that predated Latin, words that made the stained glass windows rattle in their lead frames. Whether these phenomena were real or the product of a priest's terrified imagination, the effect was undeniable. Father Letellier fled the chapel, his hands shaking as he made the sign of the cross repeatedly. He had entered that sacred space believing he could save the queen's soul through the reason and compassion. He left convinced that Marie Thérèse had already surrendered that soul to forces beyond any earthly redemption. The priest's retreat emboldened Marie Thérèse in ways that proved catastrophic for everyone involved. She interpreted his fear as confirmation that her rituals were working, or that she had indeed accessed powers capable of preserving her son's life. The temporary nature of the Dauphin's improvements no longer troubled her, because she understood them as evidence that stronger measures were needed, not that her methods were failing. La Voisin's arrest created practical problems but didn't diminish the queen's determination. Through networks of servants and courtiers who owed their positions to royal favor, Marie Thérèse located other practitioners of the dark arts. These new allies were more dangerous than Lavoisin had ever been. Refugees from witch trials across Europe who had refined their techniques through years of persecution and practice. The leader of this new circle called herself Madame de Brinvilliers, though court investigators would later discover this was an assumed name, covering an identity so obscured by legend and fear that her true origins remained forever mysterious. Where Lavoisin had been a charlatan who stumbled into real power, Brinvilliers was a true adept who understood forces that most humans never suspected existed. Under Brinvilliers' guidance, the rituals evolved beyond anything Marie Thérèse had previously experienced. The blood offerings became more complex, involving precise timing with astronomical events and the addition of substances that Brinvilliers claimed would amplify the maternal essence. The ceremonies moved from hidden chapels to deeper locations beneath Versailles, chambers that had been excavated during the palace's construction, but never officially recorded on any architectural plans. These underground spaces had been designed for purposes that predated Christianity in France. Roman ruins suggested they had once served as temples to gods whose names had been deliberately erased from historical records. Medieval modifications indicated that various secret societies had used them for rituals that combined pagan traditions with corrupted Christian symbolism. The very stones seemed saturated with centuries of forbidden practices. In these ancient chambers, Marie Thérèse discovered that her blood held properties she had never suspected. When mixed with specific compounds that Brinvilliers provided, it became luminescent, glowing with an inner light that cast no shadows. When consumed during certain lunar phases, it induced visions that revealed hidden connections between all living things. Most importantly for the Queen's purposes, it created a bond between mother and son that transcended physical separation. The Dauphin began experiencing these visions himself, whether he wanted to or not. During his conscious moments, he would describe dreams where he felt his mother's presence inside his own mind, sharing his thoughts and memories in ways that violated every boundary between individual souls. He spoke of tasting copper in his mouth and feeling strength that wasn't his own flowing through his weakened limbs. These shared experiences created an intimacy between mother and son that disturbed even the most worldly courtiers. When Marie Thérèse visited the Dauphin's chambers, observers noted that they seemed to communicate without speaking, their eyes locked in silent conversations that excluded everyone else in the room. The prince would reach for his mother's hand with desperate hunger, as if her touch provided relief from pain that no physician could diagnose or treat. Dr. Fagan documented these changes in private notes that he hid among his medical texts. The Dauphin's condition had stabilized in ways that defied medical understanding, but the prince himself had become something that the physician struggled to classify as entirely human. His reflexes were unnaturally acute, his hearing so sensitive that he could detect conversations taking place rooms away, and his eyes had developed a luminous quality that made them difficult to look at directly. Most disturbing of all were the moments when the Dauphin would speak in his mother's voice, using Spanish phrases and inflections that he had never learned. During these episodes, he would recount memories from Marie Thérèse's childhood in Madrid, describing people and places he had never seen with accuracy that court investigators later confirmed through diplomatic records. The Queen herself was changing in parallel ways that reflected the depth of their supernatural connection. Her physical deterioration had accelerated to the point where she resembled a living skeleton draped in royal robes, but her mental acuity had sharpened beyond normal human limits. She could predict court intrigue with uncanny accuracy, anticipate her husband's decisions before he made them, and sense deception with unreliability that made lying to her impossible. These abilities came at a cost that became apparent during the winter of 1693. Marie Thérèse began experiencing blackouts during which she would find herself in locations throughout the palace with no memory of how she had arrived there. Servants reported seeing her wandering the corridors at impossible hours, moving with a gliding motion that never disturbed the hem of her gown. Security guards swore they had watched her pass through locked doors without opening them. The Queen's blackouts coincided with periods when the Dauphin's health showed marked improvement, leading court physicians to suspect some form of psychosomatic connection between mother and son. What they couldn't have known was that during these unconscious episodes, Marie Thérèse was participating in rituals so complex that her waking mind couldn't retain memory of them. Madame de Brinvilliers had explained that the most powerful forms of blood magic required the practitioner to surrender conscious control, allowing deeper instincts to guide the ceremony. In these trance states, Marie Thérèse accessed knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who had sacrificed everything to preserve their children's lives. The rituals now involved not just the queen's blood, but her life force itself, drawn from her through techniques that Brinvilliers claimed originated in ancient Egypt. Marie Thérèse would enter the underground chambers as herself, and emerge hours later as something that looked like her, but carried different memories, spoke with altered inflections, and demonstrated knowledge she had never possessed. These transformations were temporary at first, lasting only hours before the queen returned to her normal consciousness. But as the ceremonies intensified, the periods of alteration grew longer and more complete. Court observers began noting that Marie Thérèse seemed to be two different people, depending on when they encountered her, leading to whispered speculation about madness or possession. The truth was more complex than either explanation could encompass. Through her blood sacrifices, Marie Thérèse had established a connection with something that existed beyond individual human consciousness. A collective maternal force that had sustained mothers throughout history who faced impossible choices. This entity, if it could be called that, was neither good nor evil in conventional terms, but represented the absolute commitment to preserve one's offspring regardless of personal cost. The presence that increasingly inhabited Marie Thérèse's body brought knowledge of healing techniques that predated written history, understanding of human physiology that wouldn't be formally discovered for centuries, and access to energies that existed outside the physical world. Under its influence, the Queen's blood rituals achieved results that bordered on miraculous. The Dauphin's recovery accelerated dramatically during this period. Color returned to his cheeks, strength flowed back into his limbs, and his mental clarity improved to levels that surpassed his condition before the illness began. Palace physicians were baffled by the transformation but couldn't argue with its reality. The prince who had been dying was not only surviving but thriving in ways that suggested complete recovery. But recovery came at a price that Marie Thérèse was only beginning to understand. The entity that shared her consciousness demanded increasingly elaborate offerings, rituals that required not just her blood but her memories, her personality, her very identity. Each ceremony stripped away another layer of who she had been, replacing it with something ancient and implacable. The queen found herself forgetting aspects of her past that had once defined her. The Spanish language that had been her native tongue began slipping away, replaced by words and dialects that had been dead for centuries. Her memories of childhood in Madrid grew dim while she gained perfect recollection of events she had never witnessed. Battles fought before her birth, conversations in languages she had never learned. Most terrifying of all, Marie Thérèse began losing emotional connections to everything except her son. Her love for the Dauphin intensified beyond reason or measure, but her feelings for everyone else simply evaporated. Louis XIV became a stranger whose face she recognized but felt nothing toward. Her other children seemed like distant acquaintances whose names she struggled to remember. Even her own reflection in mirrors looked unfamiliar, as if she was seeing someone else's face wearing her clothes. The entity that shared her consciousness assured her that these changes were necessary, that saving her son required abandoning everything that made her merely human. The maternal instinct that had driven her to begin these rituals was being refined and purified until it became something absolute, a force that could overcome death itself, but only by surrendering everything else that made life worth living. As winter deepened around Versailles, Marie Thérèse realized she was approaching a threshold beyond which there could be no return. The next ritual that Madame de Brinvilliers had planned would complete her transformation, binding her consciousness permanently to the ancient maternal force that had been gradually consuming her identity. The Dauphin would be saved, his life secured through supernatural means that would make him effectively immortal. But the woman who emerged from that final ceremony would no longer be Marie Thérèse of Austria, Queen of France. She would be something else entirely, a vessel for powers that predated human civilization, a mother who had loved so completely that she had ceased to exist as an individual. The choice before her was simple but absolute: save her son and lose herself forever, or retain her humanity and watch him die. Standing in the underground chambers that had become her second home, surrounded by candles that cast no shadows and breathing air that tasted of copper and eternity, Marie Thérèse prepared to make the decision that would determine not just her fate, but the future of the French monarchy itself. The silver chalice waited on the altar, empty but ready to receive the final offering that would seal her son's destiny and her own damnation. The decision came to her in that moment of absolute stillness, surrounded by shadows that moved independently of their sources and breathing air that hummed with energies older than written history. Marie Thérèse understood that she stood at the precipice of something irreversible, a transformation that would save her beloved son, but erase everything she had ever been. The woman who had arrived at Versailles as a Spanish princess, who had endured decades of humiliation and loneliness, who had found purpose only in maternal devotion, was about to disappear forever. Madame de Brinvilliers waited in the deeper shadows of the chamber, her face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to absorb light rather than merely block it. She had explained the final ritual in whispers that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. This ceremony would not simply transfer life force from mother to son. It would merge their essences completely, creating a bond that transcended individual existence. The Dauphin would gain not just health, but supernatural vitality that would sustain him for centuries beyond normal human lifespan. The cost was Marie Thérèse's complete obliteration as a separate being. Her consciousness would become part of her son's, her memories absorbed into his mind, her very soul dissolved into his expanding life force. She would achieve the ultimate maternal sacrifice, preserving her child not just from death but from the possibility of ever dying. But she herself would cease to exist in any meaningful sense, becoming nothing more than a whisper of maternal instinct buried deep in the Dauphin's unconscious mind. As she contemplated this final threshold, Marie Thérèse felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. The arranged marriage that had torn her from everything familiar, the years of isolation at a court that viewed her as a foreign curiosity, the desperate love she had poured into her children as compensation for the affection denied by her husband, the first terrifying night when she had allowed La Voisin to draw her blood. Each decision had seemed reasonable at the time, motivated by circumstances beyond her control or love beyond her ability to restrain. Now she understood that those choices had been leading inevitably toward this underground chamber, this moment of ultimate decision. The Spanish princess who had once dreamed of a fairy tale marriage had become something that would have horrified her younger self. The pious Catholic who had sought solace in prayer and scripture had embraced practices that violated every teaching she had once held sacred. The loving mother who wanted only her son's happiness had become willing to commit the ultimate act of self-annihilation to preserve his life. But even as she recognized the horror of what she was contemplating, Marie Thérèse felt a strange peace settling over her spirit. For the first time in 30 years, she was about to make a choice that was entirely her own, not a decision forced by political necessity or royal protocol, but an act of pure maternal will. She would save her son because she chose to save him, regardless of the consequences to herself or anyone else. The ritual preparations had been completed hours earlier. The silver chalice sat upon an altar carved from stone, so ancient that its original creators had been forgotten before Rome was founded. Candles arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate directly cast light that revealed more than normal vision could process. The air itself had been transformed through incantations that drew power from sources beyond the physical world. Marie Thérèse approached the altar with steps that echoed strangely in the enclosed space, each footfall seeming to resonate through dimensions that existed parallel to the chamber, but remained invisible to ordinary perception. Her hands, already marked by countless ceremonial cuts, trembled not from fear but from anticipation. She had moved beyond terror into a realm where only purpose mattered. Madame de Brinvilliers emerged from the shadows, her movements fluid in ways that suggested she might not be entirely human herself. In her hands, she carried implements that had been forged for purposes that predated Christian civilization. The blade that would make the final cut had been blessed by gods whose names were forbidden to speak aloud. The vessels that would contain the queen's life essence had been crafted by artisans who understood the relationship between matter and spirit in ways that modern science would not discover for centuries. The sorceress began the preliminary incantations in languages that had been dead since before the fall of Babylon. Marie Thérèse felt the words resonating in her bones, awakening responses that seemed to come from genetic memories passed down through generations of women who had faced impossible choices. Her consciousness began to expand beyond the boundaries of individual identity, touching briefly on the vast network of maternal love that connected every mother throughout history. As the ritual progressed, Marie Thérèse experienced visions that revealed the true scope of what she was attempting. She saw other women in other times and places who had made similar sacrifices, mothers who had given everything to preserve their children's lives. Egyptian queens who had offered themselves to gods of death and resurrection, Celtic priestesses who had merged their souls with their daughters to pass on mystical knowledge, Chinese empresses who had consumed poisons to transfer immunity to their heirs. These visions showed her that maternal love was not merely a human emotion, but a fundamental force of nature, as powerful and inevitable as gravity or magnetism. When pushed to its absolute limits, this force could transcend the boundaries between life and death, individual and collective, human and divine. The ritual she was about to complete had been performed countless times throughout history, always in secret, always at tremendous cost, always successful in achieving its impossible goal. The blade touched her wrist with a cold that burned like fire. Marie Thérèse felt her blood flowing into the chalice, but this time the sensation was different from all previous ceremonies. Instead of simple physical drainage, she experienced the feeling of her very essence being drawn from her body. Memories, emotions, thoughts, dreams, everything that made her who she was flowed out with her blood and collected in the waiting vessel. As her life force drained away, Marie Thérèse felt herself becoming lighter, more ethereal, as if she was dissolving into the charged atmosphere of the chamber. But simultaneously, she felt her connection to the Dauphin growing stronger and more complete. Through supernatural means she could not understand, but no longer questioned, she sensed his presence in his distant bedchamber, felt his weakened heartbeat synchronizing with her own slowing pulse. The chalice filled with liquid that glowed with internal fire, pulsing with rhythms that matched the queen's fading vital signs. Madame de Brinvilliers lifted the vessel with reverent care, chanting words that seemed to make the stone walls themselves vibrate in response. The final phase of the ritual required the offering to be consumed while the donor's consciousness was still partially present, creating the mystical bridge that would allow complete transfer of essence from mother to son. Marie Thérèse watched through eyes that were losing their ability to focus on the physical world as Brinvilliers carried the chalice through passages that led deeper beneath Versailles. The sorceress moved with impossible speed through corridors that existed in spaces between the palace's official architecture, reaching the Dauphin's chambers through routes that bypassed every guard and locked door. The queen's awareness followed the chalice as if her soul was tethered to its contents. She experienced the sensation of floating through stone walls and solid barriers, observing her own blood being carried toward the son, who would either be saved or destroyed by her ultimate sacrifice. Time seemed to stretch and compress around her fragmenting consciousness, making minutes feel like hours while years collapsed into single heartbeats. In the Dauphin's bedchamber, Brinvilliers found the prince exactly as Marie Thérèse had seen him in her visions. He lay unconscious but restless, his body burning with fever while his spirit seemed to hover at the threshold between life and death. His breathing came in labored gasps that suggested his time was measured in hours rather than days. The physicians had abandoned hope, the priests had administered last rites, and even Louis XIV had begun making arrangements for succession. But as Brinvilliers approached his bed with the glowing chalice, the Dauphin's eyes suddenly opened. They were no longer the familiar brown of his father's line, but had taken on a luminous quality that reflected the supernatural forces gathering around him. When he spoke, his voice carried undertones that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his throat, echoes of his mother's consciousness already beginning to merge with his own. The consumption of the ritual offering was unlike anything that had occurred during the previous ceremonies. As the Dauphin drank his mother's transformed essence, both their bodies underwent changes that transcended normal human physiology. Marie Thérèse, still partially conscious in the underground chamber, felt herself being pulled through dimensions of existence that had no names in any earthly language. Her awareness expanded until she could perceive the vast web of connections that linked all living things, the flow of energy between souls that most humans never suspected existed. She saw how her love for her son had created channels through which her life force could travel, how maternal devotion had opened pathways that allowed consciousness itself to be transferred from one being to another. The Dauphin's transformation was immediate and dramatic. Color flowed back into his pale cheeks, strength surged through his weakened limbs, and his labored breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of perfect health. But the changes went far beyond physical recovery. His consciousness expanded to encompass not just his own memories and experiences, but those of his mother as well. He suddenly possessed knowledge of Spanish court customs he had never learned, could recall conversations from Marie Therese's childhood in Madrid, and felt emotional responses to people and situations that belonged to her rather than him. Most profoundly, he experienced maternal love from the inside, understanding for the first time the depth of devotion that had driven his mother to sacrifice everything for his survival. Meanwhile, Marie Therese's individual existence was dissolving into something larger and more diffuse. Her consciousness was becoming part of the Dauphin's expanded awareness, her memories integrating with his, her very identity merging into his transformed soul. She felt herself disappearing as a separate being, while simultaneously becoming more intimately connected to her beloved son than she had ever imagined possible. The process was not painful in any conventional sense. Instead of agony, Marie Thérèse experienced a profound sense of completion, as if she was finally fulfilling the ultimate purpose for which she had been born. Every moment of suffering throughout her lonely marriage, every humiliation endured at the French court, every tear shed in private chambers had been leading toward this moment of absolute maternal triumph. As her individual consciousness faded, Marie Thérèse's last coherent thought was a prayer of gratitude. She had achieved what no mother in history had ever accomplished, preserving her child not just from immediate death, but from the possibility of ever dying. The Dauphin would live for centuries, sustained by her transferred life force, carrying within him the essence of her love like an eternal flame that could never be extinguished. But even as she celebrated this victory, a part of Marie Thérèse understood the terrible implications of what she had done. The creature that rose from the Dauphin's sickbed would look like her son and carry his memories, but it would also possess capabilities that were fundamentally inhuman. The maternal instincts that had saved his life would remain within him as driving compulsions that might manifest in ways she could never have anticipated. The transformed Dauphin stood in his bedchamber, with movements that were simultaneously familiar and alien. His body was perfectly healthy, more vital than it had ever been during his natural life. But his eyes held depths that reflected experiences beyond normal human comprehension. When he looked in mirrors, he saw not just his own reflection, but ghostly images of his mother's face superimposed over his features. The servants who attended him in those first hours after his recovery noticed changes that went beyond restored health. The prince, who had always been gentle and courteous, now displayed an intensity that made them uncomfortable. His gaze seemed to penetrate their thoughts. His questions probed deeper than social convention normally permitted, and his presence carried an energy that made the air itself feel charged with electricity. Most disturbing of all were the moments when he would speak in his mother's voice, using Spanish phrases and feminine inflections that created cognitive dissonance in anyone who witnessed these episodes. He would recount memories that clearly belonged to Marie Thérèse, describing people and events from decades before his birth with accuracy that court historians later confirmed through archived documents. Dr. Fagan, summoned to examine the miraculously recovered prince, found himself facing medical phenomena that challenged everything he understood about human physiology. The Dauphin's vital signs were not just normal but optimal to a degree that suggested superhuman health. His reflexes were unnaturally quick, his hearing acute enough to detect whispered conversations in adjacent rooms, and his eyes had developed that luminous quality that made prolonged eye contact almost unbearable. When the physician attempted to take blood samples for analysis, he discovered that the prince's blood had properties that defied scientific explanation. It glowed faintly in darkness, remained warm even when separated from his body, and seemed to move with a life of its own when observed under primitive microscopes. Most unsettling of all, the blood appeared to contain cellular structures that resembled nothing in contemporary medical literature. The transformed Dauphin's recovery created immediate political complications that threatened to destabilize the French monarchy. Courtiers who had been preparing for his death and the succession crisis that would follow suddenly found themselves dealing with a prince whose survival seemed to violate natural law. Rumors spread through Versailles like wildfire, whispered speculation about miracles and curses that made rational political calculation impossible. Louis XIV himself was deeply troubled by his son's transformation. The king had always prided himself on his ability to read people and situations with calculating precision, but the recovered Dauphin presented mysteries that his analytical mind could not penetrate. The prince seemed to know things he should not know, understand court intrigue with impossible accuracy, and anticipate political developments before they occurred. Most disturbing to the Sun King were the moments when his son would display knowledge about Marie Thérèse that went beyond normal family intimacy. The Dauphin could describe private conversations between his parents that had occurred when he was absent, recount details about the Queen's childhood that she had never shared with anyone, and demonstrate understanding of her emotional states that suggested a connection bordering on telepathic communication. But when courtiers asked about the Queen's whereabouts, the transformed Dauphin's responses were evasive in ways that heightened rather than diminished suspicion. He would claim that his mother was resting, that she had requested privacy for prayer and meditation, that she would return to public life when God's will became clear. These explanations satisfied no one, particularly since Marie Thérèse had not been seen by anyone outside her most trusted servants for weeks. The truth about the Queen's fate remained hidden in the underground chambers beneath Versailles, where Madame de Brinvilliers maintained the ritual spaces that had facilitated the unprecedented transfer of consciousness. The sorceress understood better than anyone what had been accomplished and what price had been paid for the Dauphin's supernatural survival. In those ancient chambers, Marie Thérèse's body remained in a state that defied normal categories of life and death. Her heart still beat with barely perceptible rhythm. Her lungs drew breath so shallow that mirrors placed beneath her nostrils showed no condensation, and her skin retained enough warmth to suggest lingering vitality. But her eyes stared without seeing, her mind showed no response to external stimuli, and her spirit had departed to inhabit her son's expanded consciousness. Brinvilliers tended this empty shell with ritualistic care, understanding that some connection might still exist between Marie Thérèse's vacated body and the essence that now resided within the Dauphin. She arranged the Queen's limbs in positions that honored ancient traditions, dressed her in robes that had been blessed according to pre-Christian customs, and surrounded her with candles that would burn until the final threads linking mother and son were severed by natural processes. The sorceress also understood that the transformation was not yet complete. The Dauphin's supernatural vitality required time to fully stabilize, and during this vulnerable period, any disruption of the ritual framework could prove catastrophic. If Marie Thérèse's body died before the integration was finished, her son might lose not just the transferred life force, but his original consciousness as well, becoming something neither human nor truly alive. Above ground, the absence of the Queen became increasingly difficult to explain or conceal. Her ladies-in-waiting had been dismissed with various excuses, her scheduled appearances canceled due to claimed illness, and her private apartments sealed under pretext of preventing contagion. But courtiers who had spent decades navigating Versailles' complex social hierarchies sensed that something unprecedented was occurring. Madame de Maintenon, Louis XIV's secret wife, possessed networks of informants that penetrated every level of palace society. Yeah, through careful questioning of servants, guards, and minor officials, she began assembling a picture of events that challenged her understanding of what was possible within the natural world. Reports of strange lights in unused sections of the palace, mysterious figures moving through supposedly empty corridors, and sounds emanating from chambers that should have been silent created patterns that suggested activities far removed from normal court life. In the end, Marie Thérèse of Austria achieved what she had always sought but never found at Versailles. She became eternal, not through history books or royal portraits, but through the impossible act of love that dissolved her very existence into her son's transformed being. The woman who had arrived as a Spanish princess endured decades of humiliation and found purpose only in maternal devotion, had written the ultimate chapter in the hidden annals of royal horror. Her story reminds us that behind every crown lies shadows deeper than any throne room, and that love, when pushed beyond all human boundaries, can become something far more terrifying than hatred itself.